Give you the floor to update us on Julian's situation, which is dramatic, of course. I would like to give you the floor, but I would like to say that after Stella will speak, you can all ask questions. Of course, there are microphones here, so feel free to ask your questions to Stella afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a great encouragement to see such a showing on a evening. I'm sure you've all had long days. But I am aware that Julian's case has thankfully obtained more and more traction over the years. He has been in Belmarsh High Security Prison now for 4.5 years. He was arrested on the 11th of April 2019. So the whole COVID era came and went, and Julian is still in there. And he's in a prison cell, which is a single prison cell on his own. And it's in a very notorious prison in London called Belmarsh, and it's also known as Little Guantanamo, the UK's Guantanamo, because it's a high security prison and it has very severe and restrictive conditions. And he's confined in the cell about 21, 22 hours a day, depending on the day. And it's a terrible environment. We were able to speak about, throughout the day, several times throughout the day, most days. And we're only able to speak for 10 minutes at a time. And I want you to imagine speaking to your spouse or loved ones, someone who you want to spend unlimited amounts of time talking to, unrestrained by external factors. And instead of this, every 10 minutes, the phone drops, and then we have to wait for him to be able to call me again. It's very disruptive for a basic communications level. But I'm also able to visit him. We have 2 children. They're 4.5 and 6 years old. And we go about once or twice a week to see Julian. And Belmarsh Prison is in southeast London. It's kind of remote. It's close to the River Thames. And if any of you have flown to London, it's rather close to City Airport, but on the other side of the river. And it's a very dreary place. It's right next to a big motorway. And going into the prison is like going through the layers of an onion. So you enter one layer and you have to go through security. And the security is very onerous. I mean, I think airport security, I always feel is like security light now, because my normal is that they check inside your mouth, behind your ears, under your feet, and they pat you down, and then you have to go through a dog search, where the dog smells you up and down, front and back. And of course the children have to do the same. Even the smallest children, they check inside their mouths and behind their ears and so on. And it's quite sad when my children go through airport security, because they assume it's like in the prison. So they show their feet to the airport security, and they do this, so that they can be patted down, because they don't understand why it's not done that way there. That's their normal. We go into a big room that's about the size of this, and we each sit down at a table. Every prisoner is on a red chair, and each have their table, and it's numbered. There are about 40 prisoners at a time. On the one side, there's a red chair where the prisoner sits down, and on the other side, there are blue chairs, 3 or 4 of them, and that's where the family or friends sit down. And we have about 1 hour and 15 minutes together. And there's a little shop in the corner where I can go and get some coffees and chips and chocolates and, unfortunately, not very healthy other alternatives. And what you see in a prison like that is everyone looks so damn unhealthy. Not only are they stuck in their prison cell for 22 hours a day and barely see the light. I mean, seeing the light in London is a challenge in itself. But also, the food is terrible. And you kind of just have to make do with junk food, which the kids, of course, are happy about. And then you sit and spend 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I can take Julian's hand from across the table. I can hug him, hello and goodbye. The children can go over to his side and sit on his knee, and he can read them a story. But apart from that, it's all very regimented. He can't just get up and walk around or anything like that. He has to put his hand up if he needs to go to the toilet, and then he gets accompanied and so on. And as the kids have gotten older, of course, all their memories of their father is of him in this, not only just in prison, but in this very room, and in chunks of 1 hour and 15 minutes. And that's their memories, that's all their experience of their father as far as their memories are concerned. And they have a hard time imagining him outside of that space. And it's an ongoing challenge for me to help them understand the predicament that their father is in. I try to expose them both to the difficulty and to the hope that there is, because the difficulty would otherwise be too crushing. I tell them that their father wants to come home, and that millions of people around the world also want him to come home and are fighting for him to come home. They understand that the fight for Julian's freedom is bigger than just them being able to be with their father and our family being together, but that there's something bigger at play. And they also understand that there's a lot of uncertainty. Of course, I've never talked to them about the extradition, why would I? But what I have told them is that that we don't know when Julian will be released. And so Gabriel, who's 6 years old, he recently started a calendar, which is a calendar, not a monthly calendar, but rather a calendar of days that have passed. It's not a countdown to Julian's release, it's a count up to his release, because there is no end date that we can predict. And so he, out of his own way of processing Julian's imprisonment, has started this calendar, and every day he adds more squares to tick to his calendar for his father. The situation in the UK has basically reached the end stages after a prolonged extradition battle that kind of turns on rather technical aspects of the Extradition Act that doesn't go to the merits of the case. The British courts and the British Home Secretary have waved through this extradition request, and there's now just a single decision that is pending on whether Julian can appeal the case or not. So it's quite extraordinary that Julian's case, which initially resulted in a ruling in his favor, the initial magistrate back in 2021 ruled that Julian should not be extradited to the United States, because if he was, there was a very high risk that he would die in custody. And the United States appealed this decision, and the High Court, which is the second level court, accepted the appeal. And the appeal turned on a piece of a diplomatic letter between the US and the UK governments, in which the US government basically formulated a way around the decision. I don't know how familiar you are with diplomatic assurances. They're unenforceable, and essentially the courts did not want to undermine the relation between the two countries, and given that the UK government received this letter, they didn't interrogate it any further. But what it says is that Julian, if he's extradited, he can be placed in the most torturous of conditions, the same torturous conditions that the medical evidence showed and the judge agreed would cause him to lose his life. That they can do that, but only if he does something that warrants it. So this is like saying, we'll only torture you if you make us. And this was wholly acceptable to both the British government and the British High Court, the English High Court. What then happened was that Julian attempted to appeal the decision by both the Home Secretary and the magistrate that he should be extradited. And in the UK, it's not an automatic right to appeal. You have to ask for permission to be able to appeal. And you would think in a case like this, where you have national governments and the United Nations and every human rights organization and press freedom group that you can think of, having pronounced themselves about how this case is an atrocity, that Julian should be released, that it's an attack on press freedom globally with grave consequences for all of us, for the public's right to know, for the future of a free press, and very concretely for journalists everywhere who are more exposed to imprisonment as a result of this case. You would think that in such a case, the High Court would grant permission to appeal so that it would hear the arguments that Julian wants to put forward. And yet, the UK High Court in June, I think, delivered a decision that was issued by a single judge behind closed doors, taken on the papers, and the decision complained about the length of Julian's application, and in 3 pages dismissed the request for an appeal. So Julian can't even make his appeal at the High Court. That's the latest decision. Now Julian has one final recourse in the British courts, and that is to ask a separate panel of 2 judges to review their colleague's decision and to maybe reach a different conclusion, to maybe allow an appeal to be heard at the second level, at the High Court. This is really the last barrier to Julian's extradition. And it was extremely disconcerting that the High Court did not even allow him to appeal. Of course, that decision might change depending on the panel of judges. There's going to be a public hearing. We expect a date to be announced any moment. of when there will be a public hearing where Julian argues why his appeal should be heard. But if this two-judge panel agrees with their colleague, then that's the end of the road for Julian in the UK justice system. There's no appeal to the Supreme Court or anything like that. Then his final attempt to not be extradited will be the European Court of Human Rights. And that's partly why it's important for me to be able to come to Luxembourg and to France and Germany and so on, to be able to speak directly to people about Julian's case, because this is a political case. And as everyone knows, the courts are acutely aware of public sentiment around political cases. Julian's freedom really turns on whether people really understand what's at stake, what he's really being accused of. Because layers and layers of complexity and straight out lies and distraction have been mounted upon Julian precisely in order to undermine political support, in order to put him in a weakened position when it came to his imprisonment and eventual trial, to try to weaken his position in terms of the public's understanding of what's at stake, so that it should become easier to silence him, easier to divide, divide and conquer, to attempt to create incentives for there to be little solidarity. Now, I think this has changed. It's changed for various reasons, because people can see with their own eyes that Julian has been in prison for 4.5 years, and this is not normal. He's not convicted of any crime. He's in the harshest prison in the United Kingdom. He's accused of publishing. He's accused in relation to the same activity that won him dozens of prizes for his journalism and his human rights work. It is the same publications: the Iraq War, the Afghan War, Guantanamo Bay, the State Department cables, and the collateral murder video. And what an enormous disconnect. It's a huge cognitive dissonance where you have him winning the highest awards, and then 10 years later finding himself in a prison cell indefinitely and facing 175 years in prison. Now, why do they want him silenced? Because he has exposed crimes and corruption and created a viable and effective form of journalism that had a real-world impact. And I'll read a cable for you. This is a little known example, but one of an enormous impact. So back in 2011, the US was still occupying Iraq. And when the US has a military occupation, it has what it's called status of forces agreements. So the US military doesn't just go and occupy a place. It enters into an agreement with the government in which the US soldiers are given immunity. They're not subject to the laws of Iraq in this case, and especially not in relation to civilian killings. And so these agreements, they have an expiry date, and then they have to be renewed, and so on. And so in 2011, the status of forces agreement that the US military had entered into with Iraq was reaching its expiry. On the 31st of December 2011, Status of Forces Agreement would expire, and then so there was a question that whole year leading up to the expiry: what will be the presence of the United States military post 31st of December? There were negotiations with the Iraqi government over a long period of time. The expectations was that it would be extended. There would be a reduction, but it would be extended. And something happened which led to that Status of Forces Agreement not being extended. And what happened was, well, a whole history of, 9 years of carnage, of course. But in terms of the negotiation, there's something that had a political impact, and I'll read it to you. It's short. Okay, so it was a cable, and the cable, a US diplomatic cable, leaked by Chelsea Manning, published by WikiLeaks in 2011. And the cable is 06 Geneva 763. And it described the execution of an Iraqi family by US troops, including 5 children under the age of 5. And this is a quote from the cable. Troops entered the house, handcuffed all residents, and executed all of them. The autopsies revealed that all corpses were shot in the head and handcuffed. So this cable was published, and the US, and also there was an air raid that was called after the ground raid, and the house was bombed. And when this cable was published, right in the middle of the debates in Iraqi parliament about whether to extend the Status of Forces Agreement, obviously this was not a very favorable climate for this to happen. And so the agreement fell through. And 1 month after this cable was published, Obama announced that US troops would return to the United States. So of course they're angry. Yes, this was a US government document, but what does it describe? There has to be a protection for this kind of information to be published. It belongs in the public domain. There should never be an argument that you will be safer for not knowing this. And what of the Iraqi people? What contempt for their access to their own history and to their own brutalization. But Julian's prosecution is really an attempt to show the world a lesson. And I don't subscribe to this being about the United States. It's bigger than the United States, or the attempting to maintain hegemony. This is bigger than that. This is about the ability to tell the truth, and whether there is any future for our ability to tell the truth and the public's right to hear it. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about the right to seek, impart, and receive information, regardless of frontiers. This is the standard. This should be the standard. It was the one that was entered into in 1948. But right now, we're facing a much more dire reality as far as the truth is concerned. Knowledge is described by many actors as dangerous. There's a kind of discussion about something that they call their terms like disinformation and so on. But there's this very peculiar one called malinformation. And malinformation is true information, but that it's inconvenient, and so therefore has to be managed and suppressed, because the implication is that the citizenry is not prepared to hear true information because they don't know how to handle it. And once you describe the knowledge as a threat, you enter into a very dangerous territory. And of course, it's not just about the theory. We live our public debates and express ourselves online, and online is a battleground in terms of narrative and knowledge and disinformation, misinformation, and so on. We've departed so far away. Why not just talk about the truth? The truth can be the only foundation. We can't have third parties managing our access to truth. And Julian's case is just one aspect, but it's a very significant one because it creates a new precedent whereby you can go after someone for receiving information from a source and possessing it and making it public. This is a crime now. It's not just a crime against any journalist. It's a crime, it's an indictment of the person who published evidence of the highest crimes, the war crimes, the killing of tens of thousands of civilians, the exposure of the rendition program, of details about the torture in Guantanamo Bay. This is the most significant information that has been put on the public record of our time, and it is being punished in the most excessive and extravagant way. Julian is charged under the US Espionage Act, not for espionage. There's no allegation that he was acting on behalf of a foreign government or benefiting a foreign government. No, the allegation is that he received information from Chelsea Manning, he possessed it, and he communicated it to the public. And the implication here is that the enemy in this case is not a foreign state, it is the public. It's too dangerous. It's not in our interests. And this has kept Julian in prison for 4.5 years, this preposterous case. And European countries, European governments remain silent. But other countries are not remaining silent. At the UN General Assembly last week, President Lula da Silva of Brazil was one of the first speakers, one of the first one or the second one. He gave his speech right before or after Biden, and he said that you cannot punish, you cannot indict a journalist who was just publishing the truth. Julian Assange cannot be prosecuted. This is a travesty. And when he said something along those lines, it's not a quote, the General Assembly Hall, with the world's leaders, spontaneously broke into applause. This is how this case is understood in all of the world, everywhere. But the United States government, the UK, and its allies are quiet because they don't want to antagonize the United States. I understand what the thinking is here, but it's not about the United States. It's about Julian and what he did, which was publish the truth. This is protected activity in Europe. This is putting into practice Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights. It is one of the foundations of a democratic, open society that is able to confront the powerful with true information that then has consequences. That's the deal. That's the social contract. And this breaks the social contract. So maybe the last thing is, Julian is Australian. He's not American. He's a publisher. Often I see Julian described as a whistleblower or a leaker. And, you know, it's not correct, actually. The difficulties facing whistleblowers are separate to the difficulties facing publishers. Until now, publishers had been protected. This is why Julian's case is such a departure. Julian received information from Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning was working for the US Army. She had access to these documents and these videos, and out of an act of conscience, sent it to WikiLeaks. Technically, it might have been breaking the law. As far as Chelsea Manning was concerned, she should have had protections for whistleblowers because of the public interest of the material. But it's a separate case, categorically separate case from the publisher. The publisher's role is to publish the information that belongs in the public domain. And what has been done with this case, which is a case that was brought by the Trump administration, was to, for the very first time, use the Espionage Act against a publisher. And to say, well, the way we're going to solve this is to extend the culpability from the source to the publisher. And we'll just say it's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy to publish. That way, if Chelsea Manning broke the law, then the publisher also broke the law. This is a precedent that is set. But think of the absurdity. Julian is Australian. He's not working for the US Army, doesn't have a duty to the US government. He wasn't in the United States. He was in Europe, in fact. Not only in Europe, he was in the European Union. He was in the Council of Europe. He was supposedly protected. There was he wasn't being naive. There are protections, right? So what's happened? One factor is the United Kingdom left the EU, right? But that doesn't really affect him in terms of the European Convention of Human Rights, which the UK is still a signatory to and is still bound by. What's happened is a political cowardice by European countries, I think. And the UK, well, we can't really answer for their thinking, but what is the thinking in Europe? Why is this tolerated? It's tolerated because it's not even spoken about. There was a press conference maybe 3 weeks ago at the European Commission, European Council maybe? No, it was a commission, and there were 2 commissioners, I can't remember who they were, and it was a press conference about press freedom. And so this press conference about press freedom, and one of the journalists in the room, and I believe he's Chinese, said, well, what about the Assange case? Because Reporters Without Borders and the International Federation of Journalists and the Committee to Protect Journalists and Amnesty and so on, they all say this is a terrible case for press freedom and that it has very severe consequences for journalists everywhere. And what is your position on that? And these 2 representatives of the European Commission were completely dumbfounded. It was like they hadn't been briefed. I think they hadn't been briefed. They don't know a thing. I think maybe this concern about not offending allies has clouded their judgment to not even see the fundamentals. Like, are you willing to just abandon every human rights commitment in order not to look bad? You can have a more extreme case. And it has real world consequences for journalists everywhere. This case is being used as a justification. It's kind of the new reality. There's a clip that went viral on YouTube and Twitter of the president of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, and he was being interviewed by the BBC, and the BBC reporter asked him about journalists that were imprisoned in Azerbaijan, and then the president of Azerbaijan went, well, come on, what are you doing to Assange? And then he went on a 5-minute rant about Julian. And you can watch it online. Of course, the BBC never aired it, but he had his own crew, and then, of course, they put this online. This is not a gotcha moment. This is a tragedy. This is the global collapse of press freedom. This is the new normal. Who's holding the standard? Certainly not the European Union, because they don't complain about Julian. You know, they use the imprisonment of journalists as a political, they instrumentalize it when it's geopolitically favorable to aligning with foreign policy objectives. It's not about the journalists. So who's going to protect the journalists? This is basically where we're at. And there's no standard bearer for press freedom. And of course, when they attack the press, they're really attacking you. Because if journalists are not safe, they're just not going to publish the most controversial and difficult things. It's just not worth it, because they're going to take the fall. And they also have, you know, they're just doing their jobs. So our entire knowledge ecosystem, our ability to be able to take informed decisions when we give power and pay our taxes is effectively meaningless, because we're not really allowed to have access to information that is problematic for the people that we vote in or are using our taxes or making the decisions on all our lives and beyond, with our supposed legitimacy that we give every time we vote. You cannot have a democratic society without a free press. This is the one fundamental right through which everything else flows. You have to be able to have free expression. And of course, these things are all connected to each other. So I think I might stop there.